The gun that killed Marvin Gaye was a gift. He bought it himself. He wrapped it. He handed it to his father. Nobody ever asked why. April 1st, 1984. One day before his 45th birthday. The man who asked the world, "What's going on?" was found on the floor of his parents' bedroom in Los Angeles, California, a single bullet wound in his chest, his voice finally silenced by the one person who had always held power over him. Within hours, the case was moving. Within days, it was nearly closed. Within months, the man who pulled the trigger walked free. But the 24 hours before that moment, the last full day of Marvin Gaye's life on this earth, contain a story that has never been fully told, a story that the Gaye family did not want examined, a story that the justice system chose not to examine, a story that 40 years of myth-making has buried beneath the weight of the music itself. This is what we know. This is what the records show. And this is what the silence has been protecting for 4 decades. To understand what happened on April 1st, 1984, you have to understand what Marvin Gaye had already survived before that morning arrived. He was born Marvin Pence Gaye, Jr. on April 2nd, 1939, in Washington, D.C., the second child of a Pentecostal minister who ran his household the way some men run prisons. The E that Marvin later added to his last name was not a stylistic flourish. It was a declaration, a quiet, permanent act of distance from a father he spent his entire life trying to escape and never could. Marvin Gaye Sr. was a man of deep and dangerous contradictions. He preached love from the pulpit and practiced something else entirely behind closed doors. Multiple family members and close associates of Marvin described, across decades of interviews, a household defined by fear, where the father's moods set the temperature of every room, where physical punishment arrived without warning, and where tenderness was treated as weakness to be corrected. Marvin grew up in that house, learning to transform pain into melody, because melody was the only language in that home that his father could not confiscate. And from that damage, from that specific, irreversible wound, came one of the greatest voices the 20th century ever produced. By the early 1970s, Marvin Gaye was more than a recording artist. He was the conscience of a generation. What's Going On, the album that Motown president Berry Gordy initially called a mistake, the album Marvin fought for at the cost of his standing inside the label, sold over 2 million copies in its first year and permanently altered the landscape of American popular music. The record that Berry Gordy called the worst thing he had ever heard became one of the greatest albums ever made. That tension between Marvin's artistic vision and the corporate machine that owned the rights to it never found resolution. It simply found new shapes across the following decade. Let's Get It On, Distant Lover, I Want You, each record a masterpiece. Each record a man excavating his own interior and handing the wreckage to a world that received it as entertainment, as pleasure, as the soundtrack to summer nights, without ever fully reckoning with the cost of its production. But by 1983, the excavation had become dangerous. Marvin had spent several years in Ostend, Belgium, a self-imposed exile built to outrun cocaine addiction that had consumed entire years of his life, catastrophic IRS debt that had swallowed the fortune of a decade, and the wreckage of his second marriage to Janice Hunter, which was dismantling whatever remained of his emotional stability. He had recorded sexual healing in Belgium, a record the world received as a triumph, a return, a resurrection. What fewer people understood was that the song was also a confession, a man in darkness reaching for the last available light. When Marvin Gaye returned to Los Angeles, he moved back into his parents' home on Gramercy Place, a mansion technically, high ceilings, wide rooms, the physical architecture of success, but a cage in every way that mattered. His mother, Alberta, gentle, devoted, the woman who had spent 4 decades standing between Marvin and his father's worst impulses, was seriously ill. His father, now 70 years old, was increasingly volatile, increasingly erratic, living inside a deteriorating mind that no one in the family had yet fully confronted. The house on Gramercy Place was not a refuge. It was a compressed version of everything Marvin Gaye had spent his adult life running from, and he had walked back into it willingly. That decision, the choice to return, to move not forward but inward, is one of the questions that 40 years have not answered. What the people closest to Marvin noticed in those final weeks was something they struggled to name at the time, and something that none of them, in hindsight, have ever been able to forget. He was saying goodbye. Not loudly, not in ways that were easy to interrupt or question, but in the quiet, deliberate way of a man who has already made some internal decision and is simply moving through the remaining hours with a patience that does not belong to the living.
March 1984. 1 month before his death, Marvin Gaye purchased a .38 caliber revolver. He did not keep it. He wrapped it. Some accounts say in plain paper, others in a box, and he gave it to his father. The reason he offered to those who asked was simple: protection. His father was an elderly man in a large house. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also the kind of explanation that, in retrospect, does not explain very much at all. The private conversation between Marvin Gaye and his father at the moment that gun changed hands has never been documented. No witness recorded it. No family member has described it in detail. What was said between a son and his father over a loaded weapon in that specific room on that specific afternoon belongs now to the permanent silence between them. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere inside Gramercy Place grew darker and more compressed. Marvin's cocaine use had reached a level that alarmed even those who had long since adjusted their expectations downward. His behavior swung between hours of paranoid isolation and moments of unsettling lucidity, late-night phone calls to old collaborators, conversations that moved between the profound and the frightening without warning, a quality of presence that made the people around him feel they were speaking to someone already partially absent. Several people who spent time with him in March 1984 later described the same sensation when they tried to recall those conversations, the feeling that Marvin was speaking from somewhere behind glass, that he had begun in some fundamental and irreversible way to leave. On the evening of March 31, 1984, the final night of his life, the pressure inside that house broke open. An argument began over something trivial, as the worst arguments always do. A piece of correspondence, an insurance document, according to some accounts, a business letter, according to others,
had been opened and mishandled by Marvin Sr. Marvin confronted his father. What began as a dispute over paperwork became something older, deeper, and far more dangerous in a matter of minutes. The argument moved through the house. Voices rose. Alberta inserted herself between them as she had done her entire marriage. The walls of that mansion, walls that had absorbed decades of this family's particular violence, absorbed it again that night. At some point during the altercation, Marvin Gaye Sr. struck his son. Marvin Gaye, 44 years old, the creator of music that had comforted millions, was beaten by his elderly father in the hallway of a house he had helped finance. It was not the first time. The tragedy is not the singularity of the act. The tragedy is its familiarity. Marvin went to his room. The house settled into silence. No one left. No one called anyone. The night passed the way terrible nights in terrible houses always pass. Slowly, without resolution, with everyone inside pretending that what had happened was finished. What Marvin Gaye did in those final hours, alone in his room, in the long dark between the last night and the morning that would end everything, is not fully known. What is known is what waited for him when the sun came up, and who was already holding the gun he had given away. April 1st, 1984. Shortly before 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Marvin Gaye Sr. entered his son's bedroom. What followed exists as permanent dispute, the kind that is never resolved because the only witness who might have contradicted the shooter's account was already dying on the floor. Marvin Sr. would later tell investigators that his son had attacked him first, that the shooting was self-defense, that he had been afraid for his life. Whether any element of this account accurately reflects what occurred in that room has never been tested before a jury. The physical record was straightforward and terrible. Marvin Gaye had been shot once at close range in the chest. He was transported to California Hospital Medical Center. He was pronounced dead at 1:01 in the afternoon. He was 44 years, 364 days old. He did not make it to his birthday by a single night. Marvin Gaye Sr. was arrested. He was charged with first-degree murder. And then the American legal system located, as it sometimes does, a pathway to a different outcome. Medical examinations conducted after the arrest revealed a brain tumor, a slow-growing lesion that his defense attorneys argued had been degrading his judgment and impulse control for years, perhaps for the entire duration of his son's life. The precise degree to which the tumor caused or contributed to the shooting remains medically and legally unresolved. What is not in dispute is what followed. The first-degree murder charge was reduced to voluntary manslaughter. Marvin Gaye Sr. pleaded no contest. He was sentenced to 6 years of probation. He served no prison time. He outlived his son by 14 years. He died in 1998. He never, in any documented statement or interview, said that he was sorry.
Here's what gets lost inside the legal record. Here is what disappears inside the autopsy report and the plea agreement and the 6-year probation sentence that closed the file on the death of one of the greatest artists who ever lived. Marvin Gaye knew. Not the precise shape of it, not the specific morning, not the specific room, not the specific minute, but something. In the months before April 1st, the people closest to him described a man who had arrived at a kind of terrible clarity about what was coming.
He told associates on multiple occasions that he did not believe he would survive the year. He spoke about his death the way most people speak about the weather, as a thing already decided, already on its way, already beyond the reach of prevention. He increased his cocaine use. He isolated himself from the people who might have intervened. He called old friends, musicians from the early Motown years, collaborators he had not spoken to in a decade, women he had loved, and had long, circling conversations that those people later described as feeling exactly like farewells delivered without the word goodbye. And then he bought a gun, and he gave it to his father. That act, the purchase, the wrapping, the deliberate handover, has accumulated 40 years of interpretation without ever receiving a definitive explanation. Was it reconciliation? A son's final attempt to offer his father something useful, something that might, in whatever time remained between them, be received as love? Or was it something that cannot be spoken plainly, something that lives in the space between what we know of Marvin Gaye's psychology and what we know of his complicated relationship with his own survival? The intention died in that bedroom on April 1st, and it has not been recovered since. What we know is this: the two great forces of Marvin Gaye's life were his music and his father. Music gave him everything the world had to offer: the adulation, the transcendence, the moments of pure grace that ordinary living cannot produce. His father gave him the wound that the music spent 30 years trying to close. On April 1st, 1984, the wound won. What's Going On was written about Vietnam, about poverty, about a country consuming itself from the inside. But Marvin Gaye was also writing about one house, one hallway, one man standing at the end of it with a particular quality of silence. He asked the question his entire life. He never received the answer. The answer arrived on April 1st, and it arrived wearing the face of the first person who had ever heard him. In the hours following Marvin Gaye's death, the machinery of the music industry operated with its customary efficiency. Motown released statements of grief. Radio stations that had resisted the political weight of his work, that had been skeptical of his artistic ambitions, played his catalog on continuous loops, as though they had always believed in what he was doing. Berry Gordy, the man who had spent 2 decades in legal and creative combat with Marvin over ownership, royalties, and the right to his own voice, wept publicly at the funeral, in front of cameras. The legal proceedings resolved with a speed and quietness that struck observers as notable. The charge reduction, the plea, the probation, all of it managed within months, in the pre-internet era when a story could still be contained if the right people were committed to containing it. In 1984, a narrative could still be shaped. This one was shaped carefully. The brain tumor became the official architecture of explanation, the structure that held the public story together and made a father's killing of his son legible as tragedy rather than crime. The decades of documented violence inside the Gaye household, the pattern Marvin had described to collaborators and confidants across his career, were not part of the public conversation. They were not useful to the narrative being constructed, and so they were not examined. Alberta Gaye, Marvin's mother, the quiet gravity of his emotional life, died 18 months after her son. Those who knew her in those final months said she never found her way back from April 1st, that she carried it inside her like a stone that had no name, that she had perhaps already known, in whatever way mothers carry knowledge they cannot articulate, that the house on Gramercy Place was going to take the thing she could least afford to lose. The house was sold, repainted, filled with different furniture and different voices. The hallway where a father struck his son for the last time became someone else's ordinary space, walked through without thought, without weight, without any awareness of what it once held. And the music remained, as it always does, as it always will. The music that Marvin Gaye built from damage, from the specific architecture of a childhood that should have broken him, and instead forged the most extraordinary voice of his generation, outlasted everything. It outlasted Motown. It outlasted the lawsuits and the debt and the exile and the addiction. It outlasted the gun and the bedroom and the probation sentence and the silence of a father who never said sorry. Every time What's Going On plays, in a car, in a kitchen, in the quiet of a late night when someone needs to feel less alone, Marvin Gaye is asking the question again. He never stopped asking it, not even at the end. What's really going on? Now you know.